Hi, I'm Chip Hardwick. I'm the exec for the Synod of the Covenant. I am so delighted to be offering you this video for month 13, or maybe it's month 14. It's July of your second summer in the Cultivating the Gift of Preaching initiative. And I'm really eager to talk to you about a subject that I think is really pivotal for preaching. I'm going to share my screen so we can get into it. Let's see. I don't think I have shared it yet. Here we go. All right, now you should be able to see it. I'm going to blow that up. All right, so this is in conversation with chapter 2 of this book that we've been reading, A Lay Preacher's Guide, How to Craft a Faithful Sermon, Karoline Lewis. And in chapter 2 of this book, she gives some introduction to ethos, pathos, and logos as she works through what it means to preach autobiographically. I want to give you just a little bit more information about this and how they fit into a bigger scheme. When we think about things like ethos and pathos and logos, it's really a question of whether or not we can draw our listeners into more faithful living, either as a church or as an individual. We are thankful, of course, that God works through us to do this, but we want to give God our best efforts. And so we want to be really careful about how we draw people into this, because again, our goal is to, in some ways, convince them what it looks like to live more faithfully. And we're lucky that some of our listeners look like this, Change My Mind. They might come in with a certain perspective and we're able to offer something different. Of course, some of them come in like this, I won't change my mind. And so we need an approach that will help us to open people's mind up to new perspectives. Sometimes it feels like when we're preaching, not everybody likes our sermons. Did I mention that not everybody likes our sermons not everybody likes our sermons when we preach, but we do have people that like our sermons. And what we want to do, when I say like our sermons, that find our sermons effective in helping bring people a new perspective that persuades them to live more faithfully. Of course, we're not the first ones to face this. Back in the book of Acts, chapter 17, Paul is in Athens and he has just preached a long sermon about the statues that he's seen in Athens and how they point the Athenians beyond their own gods to the Christian God. He finishes up his speech, and the author of Acts tells us, when they heard of the resurrection of the dead, some scoffed, but others said, we will hear you again about this. At that point, Paul left them, but some of them joined him and became believers, including Dionysius the Areopagite and a woman named Damaris, and others with them. So even Paul has multiple reactions to his sermon. If it happens to Paul, it happens to us. And I hope these suggestions for how to preach in ways that help people to do the kind of things that we want them to do in our sermons would have been helpful to Paul too. This whole thing comes under the topic of rhetoric. And in fact, you might think about this presentation as a presentation on basic rhetoric. Now, we sometimes think of rhetoric like this. Oh, I broke up with Tom. He kept pulling, I can't see this because of the thing. He kept pulling me into his rhetoric. The bar on Zoom was right in the way. But anyway, I broke up with Tom. He kept pulling me into his rhetoric, as if rhetoric is kind of an empty. We often think that, oh, that's just rhetorical. It's as if it's an empty field or an empty statement. But classically, that's not what rhetoric is. Rhetoric, according to Aristotle, is to see the available means of persuasion in each case. So, in other words, to figure out how it is that we're going to persuade people towards our point of view. If you have children, when they say, let me have a snack before dinner, or let me have dessert first, they've got to figure out how they're going to persuade you to that. And I understand that kids often have a very sophisticated rhetorical approach to that persuasion. But we're here in this presentation, in this program, we're talking about preaching. So the idea of rhetoric is, how do I construct my sermon so that it persuades people to live more faithfully? Because, of course, the more effective a sermon's rhetoric, the way a sermon is put together, the more likely your listeners will be open to a new perspective. Well, the first thing we have to know about rhetoric is that context matters. Who we're talking to makes a big difference. Well, context really does matter. Context, they say, is king sometimes. I mean, context, have I gotten my point across yet? Because context is really the biggest thing about whether your sermon is going to be persuasive to people or not. You have to know who you're preaching to. If you don't know the people you're preaching to, it's very hard to be persuasive. Now, most of us will be preaching in Presbyterian context, so we can understand various things about the people we're going to be approaching, but even there's a wide variety of Presbyterians. And so we want to learn as much as we can about the churches where we will be preaching. If it's our own church, we bring a lot of knowledge into it in the first place, but if we're preaching in another congregation, then we often have a lot to learn about that congregation, how they might respond. And the reason we want to know how they respond is this. I want you to think of Martin Luther King, maybe the most effective rhetorician, the most effective speaker of the 20th century. Remember his I Have a Dream speech. I have a dream that on the red hills of Georgia, the sons of former slaves and the sons of former slave owners will be able to sit down together at the table of brotherhood. We might say, wow, this is the most amazing speech we have ever heard. It really tugs at our heartstrings. It really persuades us to leave behind a life of bigotry and to join the cause for anti-racism. But this is a speech that was written for a specific audience there on the National Mall in Washington. I mean, what if he was giving this speech to these kids? These kids, maybe they live in Ohio or Michigan and they have no idea where Georgia is. Maybe nobody's explained to them what slaves and slave owners are. They probably wouldn't understand the metaphor of a table of brotherhood. So even though that speech is one of the most amazing speeches ever, it doesn't work in every context. My sense is it wouldn't work for these kids. And that's because listeners are the ones that determine whether rhetoric is effective, not preachers. I'll say this again. Listeners are the ones that determine effective rhetoric, not preachers. This means, for me, I learned this the hard ways. I don't get to decide the right pace of my speech and sermons. I'm a pretty quick talker. The old ladies in my church get to decide whether I'm speaking too quickly or not me. Those listeners determine whether I can speak at the right level or not. Same things about your stories about yourself, same things about any part of your sermon that is conveying a theological point. The listeners are the one that decide whether it's good or not us preachers. Now I just want to run through, I think it's 5 specific things about rhetoric. The first is the rhetorical occasion. The rhetorical occasion, that means, what does it mean to preach to this particular group of people gathered on this particular date for this particular purpose in this particular space? So for instance, as I was walking into the church today to record this, there was a funeral going on. It happens to be 2:00 on a Friday afternoon. Now, there could be lots of reasons for the group of people gathered together to gather together at 2:00. Maybe they would be together to listen to their favorite comedian or to watch their favorite basketball game. That group of people need a different speech than the same group of people who were brought together for the purpose of a funeral. If this funeral was outside in a very relaxed atmosphere, it would require a different kind of speech than if the funeral is where it is now in the sanctuary of this church, which is very ornate and formal. So what we do and how we do it in a sermon depends on who we're speaking to, what date they're gathered on, what's the particular purpose for it, and where are they gathered. I guess I wanted to tell you four things. One was the rhetorical occasion. The next, I want to dig in more deeply to what Karoline Lewis says about ethos, pathos, and logos. These are the three ways that Aristotle said that we could convince somebody of what we're thinking. He said that ethos, he says about ethos, excuse me, about logos, not ethos, logos. Persuasion occurs through the arguments, the logoi, that's the plural of logos. Persuasion occurs through the arguments when we show the truth or the apparent truth from whatever is persuasive in each case. This means that we're using logic to prove our point. And I'll give you an example in a second, but we're using logic to try to convince people to come to our own point of view. That's one thing that Aristotle says is a really effective way to help convince people. The second way is pathos. And Aristotle says there is persuasion through the hearers when they are led to feel emotion. That's pathos by the speech. There is persuasion through the hearers when they are led to feel emotion by the speech. For we do not give the same judgment when grieved and rejoicing, or when we're being friendly or being hostile. So this is the parts of sermons that tug on people's emotions or speeches, or maybe your kid trying to convince you to give you a snack or to give him or her a snack, that this is the emotional appeal of a sermon. Oftentimes stories compel this pathos. Oftentimes stories are what bring out the pathos in a speech. The last thing is ethos. There is persuasion through character, ethos. This is who we are as preachers or as speakers. There's persuasion through character whenever the speech is spoken in such a way as to make the speaker worthy of credence. For we believe fair-minded people to a greater extent and more quickly in cases where there is not exact knowledge, but room for doubt. So the better we feel about the person making the speech and making the points, the more likely we are to be persuaded by what they say. A bad ethos would lead to this. It's not that I don't accept your premise, it's that I don't accept you. The guy on the right has a problem with ethos. What is it about him that's making this guy, who admittedly on the left looks unreasonable, but what is it about the guy on the right that makes it difficult to persuade the guy on the left? Now, there's two kinds of ethos. So I'm going to dig into this a little bit. There's internal ethos, which is how speakers present themselves while you're up there in the pulpit. So what do you say about yourself? Do you tell a story where you come off as the hero? Do you tell a story where you come off as the goat? Do you tell a story about your wealthy upbringing when you are with a group of people that had a less privileged upbringing than you? What is it, and what do you wear? Do you wear very um, messy clothes in a place where formality is really prized? I had a young preacher that worked for me. He had an earring. He was determined to wear an earring, and he was at lunch with a family once, and the grandparents did not like his earring. It made him less persuasive to them. The parents didn't really care, and the kids loved his earring, and it made him more persuasive to them. But what you are doing in the preaching event is called internal ethos. But then most times people know something about you outside of the preaching event too. So how does your life in general reflect on what you're saying? So if for instance, I preach at a different church every Sunday. If I go into a church and I'm rude to people before the service, and I'm really discourteous to the children that I see, and I'm angry about where I get to put my robe and everything, and then I go up and preach a sermon as if I'm the kindest, nicest person in the world, my external ethos will have been destroyed. I'll be less persuasive to them. So here are just some things about internal and external ethos. One of the things is what you see, what you get. That means when people see you up in the pulpit, are they seeing a version of you that they recognize when you're outside the pulpit? If not, you're less persuasive. How do you express yourselves? What kind of words do you use? How do you, um, do you use wild gesticulations that, when in person you're very kind of reserved? The question is, what are you showing about yourself? What emotions do you show? Do you show that you are um, much too emotional about a topic to be able to talk about it in a way that um, that people don't feel like they have to care for you, but rather can listen to what you're saying? How old are you? That's something we can't change. But I remember when I was a early preacher, I always felt like, are people going to listen to me because I'm so young? And I had to think about ways to demonstrate to them that I was wise, even though I was young. Similarly, somebody older in the pulpit might need to demonstrate that they have the energy to be up there, if that's a struggle for them. What do you choose to share about yourself? I talked about that a little bit. What you're wearing, and we talked about that with the earring. You want to wear things that are not going to draw attention to yourself. I always ask a church, you might do this too when you're preaching, what does your regular preacher wear, so that I wear something similar, so that what I wear won't be distracting and make me less persuasive. And then, of course, do you love them? That's really the most important thing. Do you demonstrate that you love them? If you demonstrate that you love them, they are much more likely to be persuaded by what you're saying. All right, now I want to give you a concrete example of how ethos, pathos, and logos work together. Let's pretend that you have decided to preach a sermon on reducing gun violence. So you might, in the logo, so you want to persuade people to take a step toward reducing gun violence. That could be all sorts of different things. Um, but you might look at what's something you can do that teases their logos, the logic, their pathos, their emotions, and their ethos, what they think about you. So in logos, you might quote statistics about who owns guns in your sermons. 44% of Americans have at least one gun in their household. And then who owns what, of those kind of guns. That might help them to orient. It would prove to them you know what you're talking about, and it might shed a particular light on your argument. Pathos would be another way to persuade them to work towards gun violence. For instance, you might tell a story of a mother whose young adult child was killed by gun violence, and every Sunday she goes to the graveyard to visit, and every Monday she writes a letter to a congressman. On ethos, you might say something, it would depend on, of course, your background, but if you were a gun owner, you might reveal to them, I'm a gun owner and I'm concerned about reducing gun violence. By telling them something about yourself, that could help persuade them. You might also say, of course, I'm not a gun owner, but I know this family who has been impacted by gun violence. That's kind of a mix between ethos and pathos. But the idea of ethos is that you're using your own experience to make them more likely to be persuaded. So that's really what I wanted to talk to you about today, about pathos, ethos, logos, and the rhetorical occasion as part of basic rhetoric for preaching. Of course, I'd be glad to hear from you. If I can help you in any way or explain this more, you can find me at 309-530-4578 or chip@synodofthecovenant.org. I am so glad that each one of you is in this program, and I know that God is blessing you and the places where you preach. Thank you for your work. Thank you for being open to Christ's call, and God bless you.